Hi, this is Andrew, and this is Keen On, the daily chat show featuring the world's leading thinkers and writers. Hello, everybody. It is said, probably by Winston Churchill, since most repeated quotes are from him, that history is written by the victors, that we know our history because they're written appropriately enough by the people who have won, and the losers don't have a voice in history. Although I'm not sure my guest today, Kathleen DuVal, who teaches history at the University of North Carolina and is the author of an intriguing new book, Native Nations, a Millennium in North America, would agree. She is joining us from Durham. Kathleen, that phrase I'm sure you're familiar with. Is there any truth to it? And if it is indeed true, why should we be concerned with the history of Native Americans, who, of course, were the big losers in the European colonization of North America?
Well, I think, history trends come and go, and there are some eras in which the histories are written all from the perspective of the victor. And there are some eras, like I think the one we're living in, where it's not that much, where people are interested in a lot of different stories. Maybe one of the questions is why some people won and other people lost. But I think a lot of people are interested in both sides of that, and also in maybe things that aren't quite as clear as one side won and one side lost. And so I think Native Americans in the United States, in other parts of the Americas, they lost a lot. They lost a lot of land, they lost a lot of sovereignty. Many of them lost their lives. But one of the things I talk about in the book is how did they manage to retain what they did retain despite so much loss, and how did they survive? Today in the United States, there are almost 600 federally recognized tribes that are recognized as nations by the U.S. government. And so one of the things that I'm interested in is how did they keep that much, at least? How did they keep their communities? How did they keep some of their sovereignty in the midst of all this loss?
You've written extensively on this, many books. People will be familiar with your book, Independence Lost, Lives on the Edge of the American Revolution, also The Native Ground. Do you think, Kathleen, that we're living at a time where interest in Native Americans is a little bit more fashionable? It seems for a while, and you're the authority, of course, here, that perhaps for a couple of hundred years, people had no interest one way or the other in the culture and history of Native Americans. Today, there's more and more interest, maybe a degree of guilt, but also it reflects some of the problems with contemporary America.
Yeah, I think that's right. I think Americans have always had some interest in Native Americans, but it's been probably less interest in their actual history and more in sort of an idealized view of them, and particularly a view of them as only existing in the past. And so I think today, one of the reasons that many Americans and people beyond the United States, I hope, are interested in Native American history is that Native Americans are still around. And so you can see Native Americans on TV and in the movies, and there have been some really big U.S. Supreme Court cases lately involving Native nations, and in modern art and all kinds of things that show that Native Americans are still here today. And I think a lot of Americans, at least, and I think beyond that, sort of that doesn't fit well with what little they know about Native Americans as being people who lost, right? Who completely died off, or at least whose cultures died off long ago in the past. None of which is quite true, and that's why Native Americans still are here today, and why they're still members of separate Native nations today.
So the subtitle of the new book, Native Nations, is A Millennium in North America, 1,000 years in North America. Is that how long most of the so-called Native Americans were on this continent before the Europeans showed up?
No, they were here tens of thousands of years. So this is just a few hundred years of those last centuries that they were here before Europeans and Africans and Asians began coming here. And then the 500 plus years that Europeans have been here, as well as Native Americans. But a longer history could be written of Native Americans here, and sort of, I think, that's sort of in some ways the realms beyond those of historians. For those that it's well over 10,000 years, and archaeologists keep finding new sites that show that Native Americans have been here longer and longer. So even when I teach my class, and the first day of class, I talk about how long Native Americans have been here, and I actually have to keep revising that lecture every year because archaeologists are finding a longer and longer human presence here.
Yeah, it's interesting. I can't remember the name of the author. We had her on the show a year or two ago, a kind of cultural anthropologist who wrote a book about the Bering Straits. And certainly, yeah, it's more than 1,000 years ago. So if my math is right, Kathleen, and this is an easy calculation, 1,000 years ago in 1024, there were, of course, no quote unquote Europeans here. Give us a snapshot. I know that's a rather gross question for a sophisticated historian like yourself. But if we had the good or the bad fortune to find ourselves in North America in 1024, what would we see?
Well, there were many, many urban civilizations across North America, and that's one of the things that I think most people don't know. There were large agriculture-based cities with large regions where they had farms and suburbs in the Mississippi Valley, so in what's now the southeastern United States, into the northeastern United States, and west of the Mississippi River, and then also in what's now the American Southwest, Arizona and New Mexico, large urban agriculture-based civilizations that relied on extensive irrigation systems. And many of these, it's hard to say much about daily life in those places that we don't have much information about, but many of them had quite powerful leaders, what Europeans would have called kingdoms, kings and sort of religious priests. And it really was in many places, certainly not all, but in many places, especially the places where corn grows well. It was a region of quite centralized, certainly centralized relative to places like Western Europe at the time, urbanized relative to Western Europe at the time, civilizations.
So if one was to generalize again, obviously everybody needs to read your book to get beyond these rather gross, crass generalizations. But was the North America in 1024 not essentially different from the Europe of 1024? Were there profound technological differences, with differences in warfare, in literacy?
Most of those differences come later. I think it's quite surprising how, if you look at 1054, there is a huge amount of similarity. One of the reasons that there's a lot of similarity between Western Europe and North America, and I'm talking about north of central Mexico, at the time, was that they had experienced climate changes that were quite similar in the two places. It was the period of that's called the medieval warm period. And it was a time when, as the name implies, the planet had warmed. And what that really meant, particularly for the latitudes in the Northern Hemisphere that Western Europe, much of Western Europe and much of North America are along, that meant that there was a longer growing season and more predictable weather than certainly the climate period that came after that, and probably the climate period that came before that. And that in both places, those climate changes allowed the spread of agriculture, and particularly the growth of these civilizations with large scale grain and other agriculture that allowed the growth of cities, and the creation of the kind of classes that of people who didn't grow food for their living, whose food, in most civilizations before that, probably most people had spent most of their time producing food And the medieval warm period allowed in both of these regions for an era that wasn't like that, where there were people who could be artisans or priests or other sorts of jobs that didn't require growing or hunting food all of the time. And the sort of scale of the size of cities, the trade networks between cities, really quite similar at the time between Western Europe and North America.
There may be an opportunity for a counterfactual. What if these native nations had been the ones that colonized Western Europe? Then certainly the history of the world would have been quite different.
That's right. Yeah.
My assumption, and again, it's a very amateurish assumption, Kathleen, is that the more sophisticated nations, indigenous nations of the Americas existed in Central and what we now call Latin America. Is that wrong?
Yeah, that's what a lot of people think. That's what most textbooks and many historians have always said. But I think if we sort of take ourselves back to that 1054, that's not true. There are civilizations all across what's now northern Mexico and at least say the southern 2/3 of what's now the United States that had adopted corn agriculture from central Mexico. It starts, for this region, it starts in central Mexico. So you could say it was more advanced or farther along in that way. But the similar technologies, similar ways of life had spread all across this region. That sort of perspective comes from the fact that when Europeans arrive, by the time Europeans start arriving at the very end of the 1400s and in the 1500s, central Mexico is still urbanized, centralized, with very powerful and wealthy monarchs, lords ruling the cities of central Mexico. And it's not that way to the north anymore. There's been a huge change by the end of the 1400s in North America, north of central Mexico. Those ancient civilizations, the centralized urban areas have fallen, and in their place are, I would say, equally sophisticated, but not nearly as centralized societies that are more democratic, more focused on back to spending more time on food, right? But more egalitarian, and that to Europeans look primitive. Europeans don't know the long urban history. They don't know the period of climate change. There's another set of climate changes moving into the Little Ice Age in the 1200s, starting in the 1200s. That probably is the main reason why people in North America, north of central Mexico, decentralize, change their economies, and along with that, some their politics and their sort of socioeconomic structures. But then Europeans arrive and think that's primitive, think they've never had anything else, and also don't understand sort of the sophistication of their economies that combine agriculture and hunting and gathering.
I want to take a break in a second, Kathleen, and talk about the European period, their arrival, and the consequences for natives, for the Native Americans. But before we get there, one other question. The Europeans, or the common conception of Europeans as colonialists, as victors, were twofold. Firstly, that these native peoples didn't have sophisticated European notions of things like private property, but also the representation of Native Americans as, in a Rousseauan sense, of simple, primitive, happy people, hunters and gatherers who spent their lives enjoying the fruits of North America without any of the downside of civilization. Are both of those wrong?
Yeah, so Europeans are right when they get to North America and see that there isn't, in most cases, and again, we're generalizing, there aren't huge differences of class, and there aren't, most places that Europeans go, at least starting in the 1600s, there aren't huge armies. There are all kinds of things that Europeans have come to think by the 1500s and 1600s are signs of civilization that Native North Americans don't have or don't have anymore. but one of the things that that sort of political scientists have studied, and anthropologists as well, and one of the things that I sort of learned as I was writing this book was how complicated it can be to run a society that emphasizes egalitarianism. So there are systems where there's a lot of oral history that talks about the fall of cities and why it's wrong to have a king, or why it's wrong to allow one leader to take too much power. And so there are political systems among Native nations that encourage shared participation. And so there are all these rules about, say, with the Haudenosaunee, say there's a representative government, and in their great law, they talk over and over about how important it is for representatives to, say, have their skin be 7 times the thickness of other people's skin. So it's not easy to run that kind of politics. But that's the kinds of things that Europeans don't see when they imagine this sort of simple, just living off the land. And you bring up private property, and it's tremendously important, that distinction between a European's view of private property, which does lead to all kinds of misunderstandings and taking advantage of when Europeans come in and think they've bought something for all time, when Native Americans have perhaps think they're renting it, right, or giving some sort of temporary use permit to something. But it's private property and nation. Owning land, having borders is not the same. So Native nations absolutely believed that a certain part of the land belonged to one Native nation, and then another part belonged to another Native nation. And they very often had very clear borders between them, especially if the two nations were at war. So Europeans sort of take this understanding that private property isn't the same within Native nations, that it is true that many families can share land, or a town can in common own hunting or farming fields. And they make it into this idea that Native Americans don't believe in property at all, that they don't believe in ownership of any space, which is not true at all. Native Americans see land, see their country as being their own.
So indeed, Kathleen, history is written by the victors. We are speaking with a very distinguished American historian, Kathleen DuVal. She has a fascinating new book out, Native Nations, A Millennium in North America. We've really just skated the surface of the first 500 years until the Europeans show up. And we're going to talk after the break about the consequences of the European colonization, if that's the right word, of North America. But I want to remind everyone that great guests like Kathleen DuVal are brought to us because of our friends at Liberties. Excellent new quarterly of Culture and Politics. Going to run a short feature on Liberties, and then we'll be back with Kathleen DuVal to talk about the consequences of European colonization for Native Americans. So don't go away, anyone. We'll be back in a second.
The noise, there is nuance, insight. Liberties is not just a journal of ideas. It's a meteor of intelligent substance. It's the place to be for engaged citizens. Politics, opinion, substance. Liberties is a triumph for freedom of thought. A quarterly of urgency, of cultural exploration, of intellectual delight, of immaculate prose. It's invaluable. Subscribe now or find Liberties at your favorite bookseller.
And you can subscribe to Liberties at libertiesjournal.com. We are speaking with Kathleen DuVal, the author of Native Nations, The Millennium in North America. Our show has been divided into 2, the idyllic period before the Europeans showed up, and then the last 500 years, which haven't been great, I think, generally for Native Americans. Kathleen, when the Europeans showed up, did these Native nations, did they think that they were different from any other invading peoples? Was there something substantially different? Did they see them in magical terms, in religious terms?
Mm-hmm. It's a good question. It's a question that historians have asked a lot. And I think one of the things that it's different in different places for different people. So the first native people who saw Europeans, who saw them coming on a ship across the ocean with completely new kinds of goods they hadn't seen before, I think those people were likely to think, this is a really strange and different kind of people. And I should say also, most people in the world saw things in sort of religious terms at the time, so,
including the Europeans.
Including the Europeans. So in those first encounters, both Europeans and Native Americans tried to understand each other in religious terms, and perhaps in what we would call today supernatural terms. But then there are other people there are peoples, especially farther into the continents of the Americas, that their first contact with Europeans is actually indirect. It's say through some trade goods that come to them through a native trading partner, and they get to know sort of metal goods and things like that before they ever meet their first European. They certainly hear news and tales of Europeans, of what maybe their native allies have discovered about them as they've gotten to know them, those who live closer to Europeans or have had visits from Europeans on ships. And so once you move into the interior and move later through that 500 years that Europeans have been in the Americas, there's less and less a sense that Europeans might be a completely different kind of people, and more information about them, information about ways in which they might be useful, and information about ways that they might be dangerous. And also, you can imagine just lots and lots of sort of rumors and talking about how to deal with them.
Was the fundamental difference the technology of warfare?
It's easy to think of it that way, but because war absolutely exists in North America before Europeans get here.
Oh, perhaps let me rephrase. I mean, the technology of violence, not just warfare, but the Europeans had the guns and the cannon.
Yeah, right. So there are important differences there, but pretty soon their native trading partners in most parts of the Americas start to acquire guns either directly from Europeans or through native trading source, native traders in between, and also to change some of the things they do to better protect themselves against those kinds of weapons. To say, stop using wooden armor, which is very effective against arrows and not very effective against guns, and start using either using metal armor or avoiding the kind of direct battles that might be more deadly. And also, building in different ways. So say a fortified town might be what you want against your enemies with bows and arrows. If enemies are coming in with cannon, then you might just give up the fort entirely. And either fortification of the kinds that they had in Europe, or give up the fort entirely and be a little bit more on the move and ready to evacuate your towns if Europeans come with cannons. But there is, I think, the one thing that I would say is harder for Native Americans to get used to is the potential for violence just in everyday life. That I don't want to say this about Europeans generally, because it's a certain kind of European who comes to North America.
Drunken Englishmen.
Yeah, right. Exactly. Yeah, drunken English men, and many of them in the first century or so, they're veterans of the wars in Ireland. They've been trained to be pretty brutal, and that's sort of an expectation that, at least in the 1500s and early 1600s, that Englishmen bring, and Spanish men have come from their own wars in the Iberian Peninsula. They're really, it's warriors for the most part.
And it's, of course, important to remind everyone, not that most people won't know this, that it wasn't just the British, but the French and the Spanish who colonized North America. And when we talk about North America, our Canadian friends know that it's not just the United States, it's Canada as well, although we tend, for one reason or other, to think of the history of North America in the context of the United States. Was there, before the Wars of Independence, Kathleen, more coexistence between the native peoples and the European colonialists? That's, again, a common assumption, maybe a cliche, and that the European powers made alliances with the native peoples in the same way as they made alliances with each other in Western Europe?
Yeah, I think that's true. I mean, it's, as you say, it's a generalization. It's certainly not true in all places and times. But looking across North America for these centuries before the Revolutionary period, Europeans just come, in most places, they come in smaller numbers than Native Americans. And even if they have more military technology, at least at first, often they have to trade that military technology to get Native allies, to get access to land and resources. And they're there in much smaller numbers. And so they have to make, it's not that they're, kinder people, but they have to make, in most cases, alliances with at least some Native nations. And then often Europeans get pulled into wars that already are pre-existing in North America because they make allies with, say, one Native people who says, okay, if you want to live on this land and be our allies, you not only have to trade guns and other things that we want to us, you also have to come with us when we go fight our enemies. So a lot of the wars that Europeans end up in the middle of in those early centuries are really Native wars that their Native allies have pulled them into.
Might it be argued then, Kathleen, that the real catastrophe, and I don't think we can underestimate that word, for the native peoples wasn't the arrival of the Europeans, it was the wars of independence and the establishment of an independent United States of America?
I think that's exactly right. And you mentioned Canada and we mentioned Mexico, the republics, the Republic of Mexico and the nation of Canada end up doing some similar things too. So it's not only the United States, but these, this, in the case of the United States particularly, though there's some parallels with Mexico and Canada as well. A nation is founded at the end of the 18th century that is, whose members believe they have won this war against Britain in order to, for their own independence, which depends on land. So they found a republic. They look back to ancient history and see, and then more recent history, and see republics are very hard to sustain. And they say, if we aren't going to have a king, if we're going to have many common men able to vote, and if that's where sovereignty is going to lie in the United States, those men need to be independent. They can't have a landlord. They can't have a boss. They need their own farms. They need to be independent farmers. And that's what will give them the independence to run a republic, to be the virtuous citizens of a republic. And that land is, for the most part, native land. And the other reason why that's true, right there side by side with the independence reasons, is that the population of the United States doubles every generation, from the late years of the British colonies in the mid 18th century all the way to the 20th century. Every generation for over a century doubles the population of the United States. And if that population, if the free men of that population are going to own land, that land is going to come from Native Americans, and it is going to be easier and easier for the United States to force Native Americans to abandon that land as their population grows. So it's a vicious cycle for Native Americans, at the same time that it might be a virtuous cycle for the growth and expansion and prosperity of the United States.
Kathleen, we probably should have done this show on July 4th. It's an appropriate conversation, particularly given today's atmosphere in America. Was there a Native American voice in any of the constitutional assemblies? Were there the so-called founding fathers, Hamilton, Madison, Jefferson, Washington? Did they have any sense or sensibility about the native peoples in terms of including them in this new republic?
Yeah, they did. And I think it's really important to remember that even that late, even at the end of the 18th century, to Americans, to the founding fathers as to other Americans, Native Americans are still in their own nations, right? There are some Native Americans that live within colonies at that point and would become states, but the vast majority of Native nations live in their own nations. They're Cherokees or they're Shawnees, they're Mohawks. Indian policy in the late 18th century and the beginning of the 19th century is foreign policy. Indian policy is put under the Department of War, which is the predecessor of the Department of State. The mentions of Native Americans in the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution have to do with foreign policy. And so there is a sense among founding fathers that they have won a great deal of land in defeating the British in the American Revolution. But they also recognize that that land is occupied not just by human beings, but by nations, and that to get that land, they will have to do what you do if you want another nation's land. They will have to fight wars against them.
The G word, tragically, Kathleen, is very controversial these days, genocide. It's been used to describe the behavior of North Americans, colonialists, or the independent Americans towards Native Americans, particularly in the context, I think, of Andrew Jackson. What happened in this period? Is it appropriate to use this word to describe the way in which Native Americans were treated in this early history of populist democracy in the early 19th century?
Yeah, I think it's certainly a good word to think with, and it applies, very well to some times and places, and arguably well to others. And I think, some of the essential things to remember about genocide are it can be true even if it doesn't succeed, right? Just because there are Native Americans and Native nations today doesn't mean that it wasn't genocide or it wasn't genocide, genocidal impulse. And also that while there are certainly times when colonialists have tried to kill off Native Americans, there have been even more times when they've tried to destroy them as cultures, as nations. And so there can be, an element to genocide that is not just physical death, but it's also the repeated periods in the history of the United States in which the United States government and state governments have tried to destroy Native nations as polities, as cultures, as communities. And so I think it's a word to be careful with, but it's also a really useful word when looking at the kinds of things that some people were prepared to do to other people.
Some people, are you talking about Andrew Jackson and Jacksonian democracy?
Yeah. So Andrew Jackson, for example, certainly he sees himself as he's elected by white American men. He does not see himself responsible to Native Americans. And remember, this is a transition period between the U.S. government seeing Native nations and acting with Native nations as if they are entirely separate and sovereign countries, which is the way they did at the beginning, as I was talking about before, into treating them as dependents with few who are part of the United States and yet have very few rights within the United States. So Native Americans at the time of Jackson in the early 19th century, most Native Americans have no desire to be part of the United States. They want to still be separate Native nations and have the United States only be part of the continent, right? And so Andrew Jackson is part of a movement that declares in the early 19th century that Native nations have no rights as nations anymore, and that therefore the federal government can remove, they still make treaties with them, although they're forced treaties. So there's still this recognition that they are in some way sovereign, but can force them into treaties and then physically force them to leave their homelands and move west. So yeah, I think, we could argue, people can argue about what parts of the definition of genocide fit that and won't, and which don't. But certainly the impulse behind it, the assumption that it's okay for one country to treat another that way, and some of the effects do seem to fit that word pretty well.
Was that racial? Was that rooted in a racialized notion of Native Americans, a religious notion, a cultural one, a gendered one?
It's certainly cultural, and sort of the height of white supremacy and racism in the United States comes a little bit later than that, but it is certainly growing and existing in the early 19th century, and It is. If you sort of read, say, Jackson's speeches, the way he, or say the governor of Georgia at the time is putting a lot of pressure on the Cherokees, for example. They talk about they certainly talk about Native Americans not as nations, and they talk about individual Native Americans as was incapable of civilization. So if we talked earlier about Europeans, even from those first centuries when they're coming to the Americas, they believe Native Americans are primitive. But they don't necessarily believe Native Americans can never become like Europeans. So they're kind of wrong about the long history of the Americas. And Europeans are absolutely ethnocentric in believing that everybody should be like Europeans. But they don't yet have that sort of that extremely racist view that that people who aren't of 100% European descent can never be civilized, or can never be part of some place like the United States, that they actually need to be entirely removed or enslaved.
Speaking of enslavement, Kathleen, the Americans, of course, white Americans brought their own, I guess, quote unquote, native nations with them as African slaves. Did the institution of slavery exist ever in the peoples of North America, the native peoples, and what did they make of slavery? Was there a degree of competition between the African slaves and the Native Americans in terms of who was exploiting who was bottom of the chain?
The histories are so different from each other. So first of all, just sort of to answer the sort of oldest part of the question, there absolutely is captivity and slavery within Native American societies. It's of the kind that, say, if we went back to our 1054 example, it's the kind of captivity and slavery you could have found all around the world in that period. Slavery comes essentially from the question, what do you do with somebody you capture in war, who isn't killed in war? You take them prisoner, and then what do you do with them? That's sort of where slavery comes from. And so in Native North America, just like all around the world, you could find people who were enslaved. They'd been ripped from their homes during warfare and held captive by an enemy, right? Slavery is never good, right? It's never good for the person under it. But like all over the world, and pretty much, I think in 1054, it wasn't necessarily inherited by their children. It wasn't race-based. It was very, very little, if at all, like what you might see in plantation slavery of the early 19th century. So this is the kind of slavery that Native Americans have, and it's still kind of the kind of slavery that Europeans have when Europeans first arrive. But then the kind of plantation that Europeans bring with them, the idea, and grow tremendously, the idea of plantation slavery. And that's quite different from what Native Americans have practiced in the past. Now, there are some individual Native Americans and Native American families within some tribes, like the Cherokees and the Chickasaws, who do then end up, by the 19th century, having plantations, holding large numbers of African slaves. And so you could certainly see that as a time when the Native Americans who owned slaves were certainly more exploiting the people they enslaved than they were being exploited. Although that's
did they have a sense, Kathleen, then of, if not the injustice of racial slavery, certainly the oddity of it?
Yeah. And much like people of European descent, as slavery arose and entrenched itself and eventually was abolished, Native Americans disagreed with each other about it. Some thought it was perfectly fine. Some had quite racist beliefs about developed quite racist beliefs about people of African descent and believed it was perfectly fine to enslave them. Others thought this was an abhorrent practice that Europeans had brought to the continent that they didn't want any part of. And so those debates raged within Native nations just the same way that they did within the United States and Mexico and Canada.
How catastrophic then was the period, the 100 years after Jacksonian democracy?
So it's the worst, right? It actually, Indian removal happens. Large numbers of nations and of individuals, families are forced off their homes. They lose their homelands. They lose their houses and farms and get moved to a foreign place, often sort of right on top of each other and on top of native land belonging to Native Americans who already live there. There are wars that come out of all of that. Then they start to rebuild. They're mostly moved as communities and resettle as communities. They start to rebuild their politics, their governments, their schools. And then there's a period in the late 19th century, the end of the 19th century, early 20th century, that many Native people point to as actually the worst, the most genocidal time in American history, the height of white supremacy, when the U.S. government purposely tried to destroy Native nations. Boarding schools took Native children forcibly from their homes, from their parents and their grandparents, forbade them from speaking their native languages or wearing their native clothes or wearing their hair in their native styles, really tried to make these children into Americans, not necessarily equal Americans, in those cases treated as people who might be a permanent domestic workforce. And at the same time, many reservations were allotted, were cut up, more land taken away. Communal land holding, which had long been the basis of Native economies and Native social structures, was forbidden in many places. And so really it's the late 19th century and early 20th century that is the hardest period for Native Americans and Native nations to survive.
Is this, in your view, a profoundly shameful chapter? The shameful, I mean, alongside slavery, of course, and contrasting between perhaps rather tasteless, but is there a deep sense of guilt for you as a historian in terms of when you teach your students and when you write your books? And should we be thinking about reparations in terms of the crimes committed against these native peoples in the 100 years after Jacksonian democracy?
Yeah, that's in some ways it's a period where if you think about the Civil War is fought over slavery. It's fought by many people to end slavery. It end slavery, and there are many reformers who come out of the Civil War who want to do right by Native nations too. And history is unpredictable. It goes in different ways. And instead of moving toward a more egalitarian society or a society that expanded citizenship in the second half of the 19th century, instead the United States goes in the other direction, cracks down on some of the progress that Black citizens had made, and institutes just a series of oppressive measures against all kinds of people that are seen as non-white. And that's what to me is the saddest and, if you will, the worst part of that era, is that it just seems like a period when things could have and should have gone in the other direction. And they didn't. They got worse for a lot of people. And so I think, one of the things that the United States and many other nations are going to need to struggle with is how can we understand this history right, and how can we also think about all its links to the present day and what the inequalities in our society today that come out of this long history of colonialism and slavery.
You had an interesting piece, Kathleen, recently in The Atlantic, entitled "The 600-Year-Old Blueprint for Weathering Climate Change," in which you seem to suggest that in our age of climate crisis, we have much to learn from Native Americans. Is there any truth to that?
So I'm a historian, and I am much more comfortable with saying what people in the past did right or wrong or in between than in having any idea what anybody should do in the present. But I do think it's interesting that in this time of in that case, a planet that was getting colder, and when it was getting harder for people to grow large amounts of food and cities fell, that what came in their aftermath were societies that put more value on sharing, on reciprocity, on equality. And we've talked a long time about how they had wars with other people. It's not that all was sunny and great, but within their societies and often with their allies, they decided at some point that it was safer and more prosperous to get along and to share in a sort of reciprocal way than to try to take advantage of other people within their society or that they were allies with. And I suspect nobody would have predicted that that's the way things were going to go if you'd asked people living in cities in 1054. And I know there was a lot of trauma in between, that it wasn't an easy, people just one day decided, well, let's just get along better. And then they stopped having the huge droughts and problems feeding with themselves that they had before. It didn't happen that quickly, and it happened with a lot of death and a lot of trauma. So I'm not sure it's a path that's going to be super easy for us either. But I think it's at least interesting, if not helpful, to reflect that there are different ways that societies can go. There are times in history when when people treat each other worse, and there are times when maybe people think about, if we treated each other a little bit better, maybe life would be easier for all of us.
Final question, Kathleen. This is a millennium in North America. In 2024, can we still talk about native nations or native peoples in America? I've been to a couple of these, what are called reservations, which I found to be enormously depressing places of poverty, very different from the rest of America. Are there native nations left? We've done a number of shows with people who have written on it. I sometimes suspect there's a degree of wishful thinking here. And if there are, how many native peoples are left in the United States, and indeed Canada, where I know perhaps there's a little bit more of a sense of responsibility and guilt for what happened?
Well, there are a couple million Native Americans in the United States today. There are almost 600 federally recognized tribes, plus many more, plus more state recognized tribes, and they do have their own governments. I think what is useful maybe to think about them as being more on the level of, say, a state government, and doing a lot of the kinds of things that in the United States a county or town government would do. So social services for their own peoples, taking over health services, running hospitals, tribal businesses, banks, small business loans to their people. So there really actually is quite a renaissance going on in Native America these days. And it's based within Native nations, lots of cultural revitalization, linguistic revitalization. So in many ways, it's a time when really that level of sovereignty and governance is on the rise, as well as in art and all kinds of things that are more obvious to people. And one of the things I always say is, like, you think of a tribe and look at their website, and you'll see on their website they'll have a little bit about their history, but more of it is about sort of just daily life, providing services for their own people. And that's what governments do, right? So you can look on a tribal website and there'll be things about their childcare centers and their social services. And if you looked at some of the bills that passed US Congress in the last couple of years with, say, COVID relief or infrastructure funding, right at the beginning of those bills are, this funding is going to flow through states, tribal governments, counties, and towns. So they really are, part of the sort of political structure of the United States, and I don't think that's going away anytime soon. But that's something that outsiders don't notice that much. How important they are to tribal members in that way. And of course, most Native Americans don't live on reservations these days. They are just in all the same places that all other Americans are.
And finally, Kathleen, I'm guessing you're no great fan of Donald Trump. The more you talk about it, the more it seems as if Trump's attitude towards quote unquote illegal immigration is rather like the way in which the Europeans treated the original native peoples. What can we learn as Americans in the 2020s from the native peoples as we confront and try to deal with the whole question of land and immigration?
Mm-hmm. I think it's hard to take lessons from the past, right? Because one thing we might say if we were going back in the past is to tell Native Americans not to let a single European in, right? Which would be,
well, they didn't probably have much choice, did they?
Right. Well, at first, they did. They traded, and they did oftentimes. So I don't know. I find it hard to take lessons from the past, except for just a little bit of humility and just trying to know that people are different from each other, and